Well, hi folks. This is going to be a really interesting Leading Your Best Life podcast this morning. I'm with a very interesting person, Judith Fisher. She's going to tell you a lot about herself very shortly. I met her via Kate Cheney and the voting of last year, getting an independent into the seat of Curtin. Judy, thank you so much for agreeing to participate today.
Thank you very much, Leigh, for the opportunity to have a chat.
Mate, I remember when you said I'm an expert in biodiversity. Is that right? Is that right, or have I got it wrong again?
You know, that's correct, but much wider ranging things as well. And how we define biodiversity is not just plants and animals, but the interrelationships between people, the natural world, and everything else going on around us, particularly in the way that Indigenous people relate to the natural environment.
Fantastic.
That's how I'm defining biodiversity. So it's much wider. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask you your background shortly, but I may have mentioned my mate Greg Campbell has written a book called Total Reset. He spent 30 years with the Aboriginal elders up in the Kimberley, and the whole concept behind this is harnessing the power of Indigenous culture and Indigenous care for the land. So I look forward to your insights in and around that as well. But let's start with your background. Where have you come from? What's been the Judith Fisher journey?
Well, I guess we couldn't take too long over that, but I was born in Sydney and grew up in Sydney and went to Sydney University, where I originally got a Bachelor of Education. Not long after that, I was married, and my husband and I travelled the world for about a decade before we finally ended up here in Perth, which was about 35 or 36 years ago. So I had lots of experiences, which normally as you leave university, people move into their role in life in a job or whatever. But no, had amazing experiences during that decade. I suppose the highlight of that was 1 year riding bicycles around India. Wow. Before we had motorbikes there, before we had TV, before we had cars there, before TV, before any of those things. So we were quite a neat couple doing that. So following that year, we did actually have to leave India, not by choice, but Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated while we were there, which was a really frightening time. And for those of us who really liked the way things were moving, that was traumatic in itself, I guess. But we did need to leave, as many others did at the same time. So in leaving, we came to Perth and with the plan to cycle across back to the eastern states. However, we just didn't want to stop cycling. However, circumstances changed, and we have been in Perth ever since that period. So arriving in Perth with a very different background to what is often known here. And from that time, had children, two girls, one who is a physiotherapist now in Melbourne, and a lovely little grandson who's a year old, and the other daughter who is now a professional dancer in London and is currently in one of the most innovative projects going on in the UK, and her face has been all over the world just recently for her role in an amazing performance that's going on in the Royal Academy of Arts in London. So during the period of bringing up children, my focus was very much on being a mum and being around all the time. So during that period, I started a PhD at the University of Western Australia in Kings Park. It was probably the longest ever PhD allowed, 12 years it took me. Goodness. Focusing on other things as well as bringing up children, but local community projects and trying to make sure our science reached the right people. So that was, I think I finally finished my PhD in about 2017, I think. 2008, sorry. So following that, I guess my life has journeyed very much in the international world, still learning and basing on all the things which I had been doing in WA for that period, which is quite a long time, and getting quite well known. But my world took me to the international world, leading an international union for the conservation of nature thematic group, which I started, called Ecosystems and Invasive Species. I was very keen on changing the way people tackled the topic of invasive species. I was very much wanting to focus on looking at the whole ecosystems. So that over a number of years, I think I led that group for about 9 years. We gathered a membership across 50 countries, and I also became extremely well known globally on this topic and helped to change the whole approach to how we manage invasive species.
Can you just tell me, just on that, when you say invasive species, what does that mean? What's what is an invasive species?
So we're talking about species that have a negative impact on the natural environment. So if you have an area of bushland or a riverside, which is still composed of local natural biodiversity, there are many species, plants and animals, and cats are one of our biggest problems from the animal perspective at the moment. Many plants which, if left unmanaged, will cause a complete breakdown of the natural system.
And you're talking about introduced plants, like obviously a cat's an introduced animal versus a native plant.
Yes, introduced plants which have come to Australia from outside Australia.
Right.
Or another one could be a plant which has come from the eastern states, where the climate's extremely different, and there are many acacias, which you might know as wattles, which are from the eastern states, causing big problems in our natural biodiversity. But what you might ask, well, why so concerned about keeping the natural environment? Well, that is what's going to keep us alive into the future. We must maintain the natural biodiversity, our natural environment. This is the science speaking now, to really make sure that as people, we are able to survive going through all the changes that are happening at the moment.
Well, that's certainly Greg's point about the Aboriginal culture of the oneness. We're actually all interconnected. Now, the paradigm of the environment, the ecosystem, is in fact a family member, and just like any other family member, you take care and you nurture that family. It's a living, breathing thing, versus no, it's there to be exploited and either chopped down or mined, and and when you start thinking 60,000 years versus 6 years, it's a different horizon that we're looking at. So give me your experiences and learnings, particularly in and around relationships with Indigenous people in Australia. What's been your experience? What's been the learning, and what's the crossover? If we're talking about leading our best lives, not just today, but let's say for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren, what have you learned, and what have you been exposed to that's had a profound impact on you, and some of the key messages that you've got that you want to pass on?
Thank you. I very much appreciate that question, because it is critical. I've worked with Indigenous peoples across Western Australia now for over 20 years. I think 3 or 4 different projects in the Kimberley, where I was privileged to meet someone from the Kimberley in Darwin recently, and they reminded me how well loved I am in the Kimberley. So that was nice.
Lovely.
Yeah, I have been there for a little while. But I still want to take you back on another part of that journey, which really comes to that Indigenous people side of things. Following the role I had with this IUCN, I was nominated by Australia and elected to a body called the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. IPBES, we say it for short, IPBES. Many people here will have heard of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Platform on Climate Change, which keeps telling us all about emissions and things we need to do about emissions. So I was elected as one of 20 people from across the globe to sit at the very top of this equivalent body on biodiversity. And in that role, we have been changing the way people are thinking globally on this topic of biodiversity. as advisors. Our role was to advise all member governments across the globe on where to go next to tackle the biodiversity issues. So that has been an amazing experience of 8 years. But during that period, this work that comes out of, I'll use that acronym frequently so we can get used to it, IPBES. It's unknown in Western Australia. I've been giving talks now for the last 10 years trying to get people to understand it. It's not well known in Australia either, even though we had an Australian sitting at the very top. But one of the things in all of our work and all of the things we assess, topics we assess globally, has been incorporating Indigenous knowledge into absolutely everything that we do.
Yeah.
So you see an IPBES assessment, it is very much focused on what the Indigenous peoples around the globe, including Australia. I was very strong in getting some Australian work into these, what their versions of them, how they see the planet. So in that role, I worked with Indigenous communities across the globe. I've been working with them now for over a decade. And these are the people these are Indigenous people who are really changing the perspective of how Indigenous knowledge should be incorporated into what's happening in the very big picture world, in all the UN consultations, in all of those others. So they're the people I've been absolutely privileged to work with in that role with IPBES, along with the world's leading scientists who we bring together to make assessments. So that really has also highlighted my knowledge on the value and importance of Indigenous knowledge, not only from my work here in WA, but also from that international world and trying to bring them all together. So I don't know if I've quite answered the question just then.
No, that's okay. I'm just listening. I was only a couple of nights ago, a page I was reading in Greg's book where he talked about if Indigenous populations make up about 5% of the world's population, they're actually in charge of about 80% of kind of natural ecosystems. So you'd be more familiar with that. And so that talk about Pareto principle of the 20% and 80% here, 5% in charge of 80%. So as you say, harnessing and accessing and respecting and incorporating Indigenous knowledge is critical. So give me some examples of where that has worked well, because we based a lot of our study on an area called NLP, which is essentially find where something's working and attempt to model it, or at least to find out what the thinking and the strategies are that are being used that are working. So where are some great examples or case studies, either be in Australia or outside of Australia, where people and governments have accessed Indigenous knowledge and it's working?
Well, I want to come to the words you've used, access, because that's not the terminology. What we've been doing internationally is working on free, prior and informed consent and ensuring that Indigenous peoples lead the conversations. Are not the second thought. They're not brought in afterwards. They are the groups that first should be, and this rarely happens here in Australia, addressed prior to anybody else. So that's the sort of process we've been implementing in the work we've been bringing into our work. I did a really interesting consultancy for the UK government for their developing country program, where they were going to invest their funds in developing their aid program. And I was asked to assess restoration and such things across Southeast Asia, Asia and Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and come up with recommendations. So at the end of all of that, I found very few examples across all of those countries where Indigenous peoples were the lead in research or other practices. And so the recommendations I made from that for the UK government's aid program, which is now being implemented, is that they invest their aid funds in projects being led, this is to do with climate change and biodiversity loss together, in projects which will be led by Indigenous people. So that funding has now opened. So in terms of who does what best where, at the moment, I don't know that we have a lot of really good examples where Indigenous peoples are actually leading. and being given the authority to lead. We have many examples here in Western Australia, for example, where this is the messaging that Indigenous peoples are liking to make, that you should be talking to us first, or we should be the start of the conversation. Where those examples exist, I'm not sure. There's a lot of discussions at the moment going on around renewable energy and the energy transformation, for which I gave a talk only a couple of weeks ago for the Royal Society of Western Australia at UWA on the biodiversity side of the energy transformation and the fact that we're not looking at that. And also, when I talk biodiversity, I incorporate Indigenous people. But there are a number of new groups starting up amongst Indigenous peoples for renewables and where they'd like to see the future going. I hope they will be examples where the Indigenous people are actually leading. They're not just there to perhaps give permission in exchange for something else. There is an example, and I can't tell you exactly what it is right now because it's not in my memory bank, but there is one coming out of an American university where they got some big funding, mostly across Latin America and America, where the Indigenous people are actually the lead researchers. They're not there because Western scientists say, well, we need to incorporate your traditional and ecological knowledge with blah, blah, blah. They are actually leading that work. So my answer to your question is I don't know of good examples, but I do know the process that we should be working on in the future. And I think I'd love to be working with different communities to ensure they are actually getting that process in place. That will require a whole lot of different thinking also from governments and big businesses. So I'll stop there. I don't really know if I've answered your question.
No, that's good. Essentially, as you say, it's so emerging. One, as you say, it's not about Indigenous people just making up the numbers and making it look good in a press photo. It's actually about them leading the actual charge on the project. So it's an environment. We just had the referendum, so we know there's a lag in people's appreciation, well, no matter what they say in Australia. But coming back to your experiences, let's just say your time with Aboriginals in the Kimberley, give me some examples of what you saw and heard in terms of how they thought about and what they did in terms of their appreciation or their caring of the ecosystem.
Okay. So going back probably 2010, I think, I worked in Broome with Environs Kimberley and the traditional owners of the Dampier Peninsula. Now, they were really quite ahead. That project I was involved with, it went for 3 or 4 years. That was quite ahead of its game. I think that would actually be an example of what I've just spoken about.
Yeah.
Where we worked with the traditional owners on a significant, the monsoon vine thickets, which are culturally significant to the Indigenous people on the Dampier.
Monsoon, what are they?
They're called the monsoon vine thickets. There are patches of them all across around the coastal areas of the Dampier Peninsula and also within Broome itself.
Mm-hmm.
So they are a highly and culturally significant plant community, or whole community, ecosystem rather, to Indigenous people. They have so much cultural significance going back indefinitely. So in that project, we were trying to assess what the impact of fire was on those culturally significant places. So I guess I came in as a scientist to lead the way we did the science, to make sure it was ecologically accurate, but also being led by Indigenous people, and we were bringing their knowledge together with the two. In that project, when I spent a lot of time on the ground with the Bardi Joey and the Nilu Rangers, right at the top of the Dampier Peninsula and coming further south, we actually measured with the rangers. I designed the ecological way of measuring. They have the cultural way of measuring. And they did the measuring once the design was made. But what we found from that was people had thought that, or Indigenous people or the Aboriginal people had thought that a fire was not impacting the monsoon vine thickets. They thought it was stopping at the edges, but our science showed differently. It showed that we did a whole remote sensing on fire history. We did ground truthing. We measured vegetation inside the communities and outside, and we measured ant communities. And when we put all of that data together, we found that the fires were actually impacting the monsoon vine thickets, which was very critically important knowledge for people. They changed the way they did their fire management practices based on that. And even more significantly, that science, which was really led by Indigenous people, with me just helping with the ecological side, enabled the monsoon vine thickets to be listed in the IPBES Act, which is the federal government's legislation which protects particular places of importance. So that those monsoon vine thickets were then based purely on that data we collected with the Indigenous people, were then listed as endangered or critical. I can't quite remember which now, which meant they were protected into the future. At the time this was happening, was the same time when there was a lot of issues going on in the Kimberley regarding oil and gas, and a lot of those projects, which in the end didn't go ahead, were based on monsoon vine thickets. So that was a critical project, working with the cultural and significant projects. That's one example. I don't know if that is answering the question, but
no, that's great.
Really critical. And they've got on, they've just done so much more work now in the Kimberley with Indigenous people actually leading for things. So I think that would be probably, when you say examples of what's happening now, I think there are many case studies probably in the Kimberley, and that particularly around that Dampier Peninsula where this is happening. Yeah.
Right. Well, just on that, what's your view? I mean, is it possible for mining, oil and gas, Indigenous people and the ecosystem to work together or not? How, and if it is, how might that happen? Because clearly that's a big issue in that, on the one hand, Australia wants export income, oil, gas, mining are all major sources of income. We've got people saying, well, we want to replace all of that export income with future focused energy. I sat in on John Howard's speech before the last election just to go, who is this guy? I mean, I know him as in the background, but he literally gone, while the rest of the world are buying it, it's $118 billion or even more in export income. We should sell it because where else are we going to get the 118 billion? So the economic argument. So from your point of view, as an expert in these areas, what's the future? I mean, is it possible? And you tell me your view.
It's critical that it must happen. Now, I'm saying
what must happen, as in oil, gas mining must continue, or what?
No,
must happen?
they must work both.
They must work together.
No, not just. Yes, it's critical that the biodiversity side. It's not just about emissions, which has been troubling me greatly, which is why I was pleased to give a talk at UWA a couple of weeks ago. All the focus is around reducing emissions. In our IPBES work, we brought together, I'm going to come in a circle back.
That's okay.
Which is the way often Indigenous people will operate. We brought together 40 of the world's leading scientists on climate and 40 of the world's leading scientists on biodiversity. We put them in the same room and we produced a workshop report. The findings of that workshop report have changed what's happening globally, but hasn't really changed anything much here in Australia. The findings said you cannot tackle climate change and biodiversity loss separately. If you tackle climate change on its own, we are going to go more backwards. So this is really part of this energy transition. The world will actually go backwards if we don't, and this is the science from the world's leading scientists. This is out there in the public domain. So if we don't tackle both the biodiversity, the zero emissions targets that people are suddenly making, and Indigenous people as one integrated group, then the solutions will not occur and the economic solutions will not occur. And the reason I'm really mentioning these, coming back now to your economic side of the question, the economics will not tie up. At the moment, we have many big businesses looking with glowing eyes on critical minerals and heavens knows what else. The world is changing away from here at a rapid speed, which I also introduced into this talk. The EU, the UK are implementing now such strict regulations on anything that will be imported to their countries, and it'll expand to other countries. If they do not do the best practice and the highest level practice with Indigenous peoples, social equity, justice, and biodiversity. The UK government has just introduced a legislation. No one there now can do any project without proving that without being able to prove a biodiversity net gain from their projects. And it must last for 20 years. So that
a biodiversity, what, sorry? A biodiversity?
Net gain. So
net gain, a biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, so if we had a mining company, for instance, who is proposing to do ABC, they would not get permission to do that.
Yep.
Through their legislation currently being introduced, unless they could prove that. So the economic argument for me, and from the knowledge I know, the businesses will lose their economies unless they actually start to incorporate this and be ahead of the game. Western Australia is often way behind the game in what's really happening because we're so focused on making a lot of money out of whatever. But the other countries are actually jumping ahead. The EU's legislation are constantly changing and updating. Nothing can go to the EU unless it's got all sorts of good environmental best practice, people best practice, justice, and ecology, and working with local communities and Indigenous communities. The economics have been proven. There are ways. This is becoming a risk for big business now. If they do not take these things at the leading edge, not just putting up emissions targets and saying we're going to meet this and then greenwashing how they meet it. The way of doing it actually is now, if they don't do it, is a big risk to business. We're not getting businesses here in WA to understand that. I've been working with a number of businesses, both here and internationally, on trying to help them to understand the economic risk. And this is an economic risk to both Australia and Western Australia also. You know, going back to the conversation you had about the argument about economies, and we'll be broke. I suspect we'll be even more broke if we don't do these other things, particularly into the energy transition, which is going on, which is really probably one of the biggest issues on the globe right now. So it's a risk to the economy, it's a risk to a business's economy, and there's plenty of data to show there. The UK government implemented a quite fascinating report called The Economics of Biodiversity. It came out of an earlier IPBES report, which pointed all of this out, and it's all sitting there for people to read. So we really need to get change happening here, but obviously the way to change big businesses has to be around economics, and there's enough data and knowledge around to show that if you do these other things at the top of the space, not at the bottom as a tick box, and then they're all busily going on their zero emissions and how they're going to reach that, we must do the two together. So economically, I could say and suggest, unless this is brought into the conversation very quickly here in Australia and Western Australia, the economy will actually probably go backwards because nobody will want our products.
Wow, that's interesting, because essentially what you're doing there is you're changing the criteria, you're changing the commercial ecosystem, and reminding me of Edward de Bono talking about in some part of Europe they changed the rules to say you have to emit. So the manufacturing plant, the factory was on the river. They took in water to work with their manufacturing, and they pumped water out. And the rule had to be that the water you pump out had to be cleaner than the water you took in, versus in the past, who cared what came out the other end because you had a factory. So essentially you're changing the economic landscape you're reminding me of one of my clients who sold tires to the mining industry, but because they had a safety issue, the big mining companies said, okay, you've scored so poorly on safety, we can't do business with you. Versus what's our safety got to do with you?
That's
Well, that's part of our commercial criteria. We have to be in our ecosystem. We have to be dealing with companies that hold safety as highly as we do. So all of a sudden, all these suppliers started to improve their safety. So essentially, what you're doing here is very much like nature. You're changing the conditions upon which people can trade, and all of a sudden, what the hell? What's how we deal with Indigenous people and the ecosystem got to do with coal being sold to China or wherever? All right, very clever, very clever. I mean, human beings. What we know about the brain is when you ask the brain a question, it ponders it until you get the answer. So here, okay, guys. Well, you're going to work, as you say, with Indigenous people. Biodiversity is going to be improved. And all of these things. And of course, the imperative comes and they come up with the answers. As you said, get people in the room, get all the brains in the room. We call it perturbation. You perturb them, the thermodynamics changes, and pop out comes the answer that didn't exist before. In fact, I think I remember Einstein saying the problems we have facing us must be solved with a different level of consciousness, a different thinking than the thinking that created the problem. And so what you're doing is saying, with the data you have and the case studies, and as you say, accessing Indigenous knowledge, we have a different level of thinking, which means we end up with different level, higher quality solutions. Marvelous. So on a day-to-day basis, Judith, what does your day look like? We like to say, what does people's days look like? If this is your mission, what is your day and what does your week look like?
It's very full. I suppose COVID changed me completely because we kept going internationally with our IPBES work, which meant I was living in a world of different time zones. We were bringing people together from 150 countries into Zoom meetings. We had to bring time zones. Australia was always the one in the middle of the night. But in that process, we really learned how to communicate really differently on getting messages around. And including in that, we would have big plenary meetings of all governments and others, of which we on this multidisciplinary expert panel had to oversee the whole process, observe and make sure it was going correctly. And all of those discussions with hundreds and hundreds of people in Zoom were being translated into 6 UN languages. So there's some experiences. My role in there has now ended because of my time. It's a time-ended thing. My day-to-day life at the moment is actually getting right back on the ground. I'm working very much on ecological projects, which means I'm doing an awful lot of field work with the City of Mandurah, who once again have adopted a methodology which I developed going back in 2010 to measure the baseline status of biodiversity so that you can measure change over time when you do restoration. So I'm working very closely right at this moment on field work, which is great, loves to get back on the ground. But also in my day-to-day, that's field work time. Then there's night times. I'm still advising the European Commission and others in Europe and across the UK on biodiversity because they respected my knowledge so greatly from my time on IPBES. So that can mean nighttime Zooms again, or it means... So I'm moving very rapidly from all sorts of different types of activities, also working as a very casual business advisor to a large American company. So my day-to-day is very varied. I'm being forced to spend some time on the ground, which I'm loving, getting right back into the ecology. But I work long hours and I probably work 7 days a week, yeah.
So just on that, if I was to ask you what motivates Judith Fisher and why?
Well, what motivates me and why? We need to fix this planet. I've been privileged in those international roles. I've had to work with the most incredibly talented people from across the globe. And that motivates me to keep going because I know we have the knowledge and I know we have the solutions for the future.
Mm.
But my motivation's often low when I'm in Western Australia. It's high when I'm not, because it's such a difficult task here in WA. But I keep driving myself because I know change can happen. I've seen it happen at a bigger picture. But why am I doing this? It's a really good question. Much of it's pro bono, just because I think someone has to do it. We need to change the way things are happening. And I guess in the world I've been in, I've learned a lot and contributed a lot into how that change can happen. I don't know if that answers your question. What motivates me? The future of the planet, really.
Well, we need to fix this planet, as you're saying. Someone's got to, it just reminds me, someone's got to do something. And I remember JFK saying, someone's got to do something. Then I realized I was the someone.
Yeah, well,
it's part of it. But the other piece there, I'm thinking as you're talking Western Australia, because I think in terms of psychology, you know, in the sense
yes,
of,
totally.
you know, what behavior, where do we get our pleasure from? Pleasure, pain. And at this point in time, and then the other part of it is the Kubler-Ross grief curve: denial, anger, bargaining, frustration, depression, acceptance. They haven't got to acceptance because they're essentially, in a lot of cases, going, well, we're living quite okay. I mean, you just have to drive through the leafy suburbs of Dalkeith or Cottesloe or Nedlands and go, what's the problem? Everything's going okay by me. So where's the problem? Because we just have to look out our own windows in Dalkeith and Nedlands and some of these places. I'm not in any pain. So where's the problem? And as you say, well, whether it be the climate or diversity, and we know there's a problem, but looking out those windows, there's no pain. So that's part of the problem in terms of denial, let alone as you apply pressure, because the other side of it is in any change process, we talk about force field analysis. What are the forces for, driving for, versus what are the forces against? And in terms of, we saw it in the referendum the other day, you know, mobilizing, there are powerful forces that say, let's keep the status quo. So it's like, how and where do you mobilize the forces to actually make the change? And I think back to, you know, I read Bob Hawke's biography years ago when he said, you know, politically, there's like, it goes through 3 generations of irritate, educate, legislate. You know, from the days people were chaining themselves to trees, who are these, or even protesting against the war, to, oh, actually, that's okay. Now it's like there's this lag time. So in terms of recruiting the forces for, to, in a way, turn up the temperature on these groups that go, we don't need to change. Again, where has it worked well? And obviously you say in Europe seems very well advanced. And if I talk to some of the people I know, well, I would call semi-right wingers, they say, oh, they're all this pinky, greeny stuff. They're going to destroy the world. They don't understand economics. Most of them wouldn't even know how to, you know, fill out a balance sheet. They're some of the forces against. So where have forces been mobilized well and made great progress? In Europe, as you're saying, you come back to WA, we're so kind of living in denial, it seems to me. And so then get ready for the anger and bargaining and frustration and depression before they even get to acceptance. So where have we seen acceptance and great progress in terms of force field analysis moving forward?
I think we're starting to see it now. And I think in terms of your comments there about the leafy suburbs and looking out the window and everything's fine, the only way we're going to make change happen at that level, which is WA, is to talk about the economics of it, because it's very driven by money. What the science tells us now is we can, if we want to fix the planet for the future generations in a way that we can all live here in a healthy way, we can do the conservation, the greeny type things, which some of you've mentioned. We can do conservation, we can do restoration, we can do management of natural environments. The only way we are going to actually resolve the issues that are happening globally is to change the way, and locally, even though people may not quite see it just yet, is to change the way businesses do their business. Now, this is taking off globally. So coming back to what people can't see here in perhaps WA, they will see it if they start looking at the economics of this. And if they start looking at the economics of this in a different way, not the way they've done it before. This is change making. This is a changing making, looking at how they are dependent on the natural environment. There's a lot of conversations about, well, we have impact, we roll something over, we do that or whatever. But once you start to talk to these businesses about how dependent their business is, and so their livelihoods are on the natural environment, and you get them to analyse it, that will change. That's how we make that change happen. Now, this is happening globally. In December last year, all the governments of the world signed what's called the Global Biodiversity Framework. 196 governments have signed up to that.
Did Australia sign up to it?
Including Australia. Minister Plibersek attended the meeting. She is now trying to bring the thinking called this nature positive into that. So at that big meeting in Canada last year, normally at these biodiversity meetings, it's governments, it's conservationists. At that meeting in Canada last year, there were more businesses there than there were all of those other factors. They were all there trying to work out how to do that. So since that time, now that all the governments have signed up to this globally, it's called the Paris type agreement for biodiversity, is a way to think about it. But there is, in what they've signed up, there are 2 targets which must be met both by finance and investors and by businesses. So there's now a framework for them to go forward to try and meet that. So there's all sorts of new groups establishing all around the world now on business for nature, business for this, business for that. So it's happening quickly. There's all sorts of new frameworks, and everyone's rushing with new frameworks to be ahead of the game. So in answer to your questions, it's moving very quickly. It's probably moving more quickly in terms of change management than anything else that's going on the planet at the moment. So it's incorporating both biodiversity I'm talking in the business world now, their dependency on biodiversity. It's not just about, well, we're ticking boxes doing an ESG, which says we're going to meet net zero by ABC. Now this is really trying to turn the whole thing around to get them really to put that natural environment at the top and to show the business risks if they don't and the business benefits if they do. So to me, in terms of Western Australia, and coming back to what you said about Western Australia, I imagine once we can start to get even 1 or 2 big businesses to start taking the lead on this, others will probably follow when they can see that some big businesses know how to do this. That's the challenge. I find that a big challenge for me right now here in just Western Australia, because I'm sitting still for a bit. But that's the challenge we need to come to. It is happening globally. No particular case study, but there's so much going on. It's very rapid.
Well, that's good news. That's good news. And you're coming back to the old thinking in a way was that the company as an entity or the organisation or the factory as an entity was independent. That is, we just made cans of this or made shoes. But what you're doing, and of course it's part of Indigenous culture. No, we're all interconnected, mate. You're not an island that's just pumping out shoes and making money. You're actually this. You've talked about it, the one integrated group, and again in Greg's book, the whole concept of oneness. We're all part of this interconnected as you say, the word ecosystem. I love the word ecosystem. I use the word ecosystem in so many different ways, in the sense that, it's not just a system, it's an ecosystem together. But separate to that, I always like to ask people, because we say leaders are readers. So what book or books is Judith Fisher reading at the moment?
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not reading books as such.
What do you read?
I'm keeping the closest watch and reading a lot on what's happening around the globe. And that requires perhaps reading the latest scientific paper, reading the latest knowledge. And much of that knowledge now that we're getting and moving with is not really coming through academic papers. It's coming through groups sharing their knowledge on what they're doing. So my day, when you asked about my day starts when I first wake up, finding out what's been happening around the globe. I find LinkedIn very helpful. I've been asked to write a piece, as I'm considered in another world as a global thought thinker, a leading global thought thinker. I've been asked to write a piece on that. And I'm really trying to think what I want to write. But in terms of reading now, coming back to reading, I'm reading up. When we wake up here, lots gone on in the other part of the world because of the different time zones. So I'm reading what's happening in other places. I'm also reading what's happening here. I'm watching some change, which is now occurring. The Minister for Environment is now starting to talk about the changes she's hoping to make. I would hope that she's really going to take this seriously, and not that the business side is a big part of her discussions. So in terms of reading, I'm reading what's going on. I'm keeping in touch with what's happening. So that's how I start my day, reading and updating myself on what's gone on. During the day, I'll get on with my own business, doing what I do, now enjoying some field work. And then in the evening, I'm reading what else has gone on. So that's my reading. I'm sorry.
No, good. That's okay. And I keep thinking back to all that cycling you did. Do you cycle these days, or what do you do in terms of looking after yourself mentally and physically?
Not a lot of time for that, but I guess swimming would be my one for these
Swimming?
days. Yep.
When do you do that?
When I can, during the day when I need a break. If I'm working from home, if I'm out in the field, then my exercise is walking around the bush. So depends on what my activity is. But during the day, I would do my swimming. In the middle of the day when I need a break. Yeah.
And when you were in India, did you get involved in any meditation or ashrams or any of those things, or what were you doing there?
No, we didn't. We were just traveling. We were on our bikes. We were there for close to a year. We probably cycled 80 to 100 kilometres a day. And by the time you get in those Indian conditions, by the time you get to where you are, you have to find accommodation, food yourself, but always visiting all the different
temples and so on.
Yeah, just all of those, and engaging with people. And really, I think that time there is probably when I'm thinking now, going back to why do I do what I do, I think what I learned there about what the spiritual side of us can do is probably what drives me keep going now, because I do know that the spiritual side of us is critical in making change happen, and that Indian time was very valuable in that, I think.
So just on that, if you reflect back on that time in India, what were some of the impressions or the lessons that you came home with? What were some of the lasting lessons, or even life-changing or paradigm shifting impressions that you got from that experience?
Poorness. People are so very poor, but they're still happy. You know, they're not not being driven by the dollar. They're not being driven by the almighty dollar. And I suppose also you're getting me to reflect, which I haven't done on this before, or probably did do some time back, but haven't done recently. Perhaps that's also what's driving me on this, because there are so many poor people in Australia, and Indigenous people are sitting, as we've just heard a lot about, in that category. And we really don't, we're such a wealthy country and nation and world that doesn't need to happen. So I think the real kindness of poor people as you're walking along and driving along and just wanting to talk, know who you are, what are you doing, where did you come from? And going back that many years, they would always say to my husband, what does she do? They wouldn't speak directly to me. They might do now, I think. But in those days, it was, what does she do? What does she do? And what's a woman? What's she doing riding a bike? That sort of real poor, the poor people and their inequality and their religion and their deep connection to culture and spirit is probably really what's been driving me, that we need to make change for all sorts of people. And perhaps those with a lot of money, would be wonderful if we could get them to think a little differently as well.
Well, two different worldviews, two different worldviews. So, Judith, as we move towards a close, is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like me to ask you to help add to this interview in any particular way? Anything I haven't asked you?
Probably not, but I think I'm really, really concerned at the moment about, so I'll just talk to you about my current concerns here based in WA. I'm extremely concerned about this decarbonisation that's going on and the lack of consideration of all aspects of the decarbonisation. I've tried, as I said, I gave a talk. I've now actually given that talk to someone fairly high level, and I hope they'll look at it more carefully. But there is the science behind why we need to look at this whole decarbonisation picture in a different way. I was privileged to spend about 6 months for Fortescue Future Industries as their principal ecologist on their global programs.
Mm-hmm.
And in that period of time, I learned so much about renewable energy, green hydrogen or renewable hydrogen, and the whole interrelationship. But that was working globally. So that, for me, is the driving force of where I'm thinking to on the decarbonisation. But I'm extending past what I was doing there to really thinking about the people and the biodiversity and interrelationships of this. This is going to be critical. These are massive projects that people are preparing to do with massive impacts unless they look at the whole picture. So that's my current motivation, I suppose, here in WA, is how do we get that message into the right ears so that they can hear it and be potentially part of the change making that we need to do.
Yes, well, we say process. What is the right process to make that happen? And as you say, you're really talking about Indigenous people, investors, mining company, government, all getting around the table going, how is there a way to form a consensus view where everybody wins here? Or is it a win-lose game? And obviously when we're talking oneness, it has to be win-win. Everybody has to win here.
That's right. And that's the philosophy for everything I've done and have been a change maker for a long time, is that you talk about the benefits to everybody. It's not one against the other. It's not combative. It's talking about the benefits. There are many benefits to Western Australia if they were to look into this right now, and to all the businesses. The critical minerals industry is a rapid rush. They're all wanting rapid approvals.
Yeah.
But let's take some time to think about the bigger picture. Look at the whole supply chain, the whole value chain within a business and globally. So I think the process, as you've just referred to, is actually, I did a really interesting conversation talk to the Water Corporation, and I spoke about change making to them. And I believe the process I used in that talk was outline the science, outline the benefit, and this is where you could potentially go next to be a global leader. They have accepted that and they've taken that on board, and they have now lifted what was, as far as I understand, the feedback I received, what was initially just sitting at the bottom has now been lifted into the corporate structure of their department. So that it's about benefits to everybody. It's about no one's trying to stop anything. It's about what are the benefits to everybody.
We need to fix this planet. And just as if we're selling a can of soup or anything, you sell on benefits. You say, don't sell the features. You can talk features, talk advantages, but sell the benefits. How's this going to make my life better, easier, healthier, more enjoyable? As you say, in this case, a better future, a brighter future, a healthier future. And again, we're talking here your grandchildren and your grandchildren's grandchildren. Which I just love that Indigenous statement of we're custodians of you don't own it, mate. You don't own it. You are actually custodians, and our goal is to pass it on in at least as good a conditions as it in, if not better. Yeah. Otherwise, what the hell have you done? And in fact, as Greg has said in his book, and you'd know, he said the Aboriginals go, the role of human beings is to actually care for the environment and pass it on so that it does continue to go on for the next 65,000 years, as distinct from let's destroy it in 200 years or less.
Yep, that's right. Yes, we're talking exactly the same language, but how you talk it to the general public is a critical thing. And I guess I've been trying to do that now for probably close to 30 years here in Perth.
Well, one of the things we know, and this is what we teach, is learning occurs in the body. It's like what experience do you give people, and how do you create a learning experience? And one of the things Greg recommends is ideally kids in their age 11, 12, 13 or thereabouts all go and spend 6 months in the bush with the Aboriginals to actually experience company, experience our First Nations culture. And just imagine across a generation, if you could actually get 80% or more of kids that are out in the bush living with our First Nations people there and living in country, then their whole thinking, talk about level of consciousness changing, their consciousness around appreciation of First Nations people, appreciation of country, air, interconnectedness, and also building up their own resilience. I think it's a bold, but I think a great idea to go for. And the Aborigines say in the Uluru Statement, walk with us. And so Greg had spent time with Paddy Rowe or Lulu up there in Broome, and that walk that they do through the 9-day walk. And I mean, the whole concept of come walking with us, and in walking with us, we understand each other, but you also experience country. And I think there's something to that's part of it. If, you know, those living in the leafy suburbs the only time they take their shoes off is when they walk from the beach at the bottom of Eric Street steps to the waters of Cottles. I go, well, I love nature. That 5 seconds I walked on the sand is just marvelous. So, well, mate, go walk 9 days in bare feet and see what happens. You know, there's a whole other world the world that you can't see, as we say. You know, there's the visible and the invisible, and we want to deal with both. Jude, is there anything else you'd like to say? In fact, how do people get in touch with you if they want to find out more or get you to do a talk or, you know, your consultancy services? How do they find you?
LinkedIn. I don't have a web page. Haven't had time to make one, but LinkedIn is a good location. I can give you an email address if you'd like. Judith.fisher@uwa.edu.au, where I'm an associate professor. So yes, probably LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. Twitter's changing as a place to make change, share information. Facebook, but that's different people use different things.
Yes.
Probably LinkedIn, I think.
LinkedIn. Well, Judith, as you say, going from cycling across India, the PhD, as you say, IPBES is so important. The oneness, the integrated group. But as you say here, just like we need to fix the planet. We need to fix the planet. And if you don't, who will? So thanks so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And let's get this out there, because if we're going to lead our best lives, we've got to create the best planet that we can live on and with, not just on, but with. Thanks so much for your time today, Judith.
Thank you for the opportunity, Leigh. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.